Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this time we have to come together as a family and learn about you and worship you and praise you for all that you are. Lord, help us to not just enjoy this time together, but to seriously think about the things you are teaching us that we can use in our lives to help others. Lord, we thank you for the food, and we thank you for the ice cream, and we thank you most of all for you. And I pray this in your name, Lord Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
All right. So the class is going to be called Is There a God? Because this is what you guys chose after the last apologetics class. And I think the question is really an important question. In fact, it's probably the most important question anybody can ask or answer. How you answer, is there a God, is going to affect the way you live your life. It's going to affect the way you treat others. It's important. It's the first existential question when you're forming your worldview. But we have to understand the why. Why is a really powerful question too. We believe in God, but do we have evidence, or are we just trusting what people have told us? There's nothing wrong with that. That's faith. But evidence is better, because when people challenge your faith, you have evidence to support what it is you've talked about. And we talked about it on Sunday. It's really all about this. It's spiritual warfare. And Paul puts it really good here in 2 Corinthians. He says, "For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does." Whether we like it or not, we're in a battle. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. They're not physical weapons. They're not swords and shields like the armor of God. That's metaphor. On the contrary, they are divine power to demolish strongholds. What's a stronghold? We should all remember. We just talked about it, right? But Paul explains it really clearly just in the next sentence. He says, "We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought and make it obedient to Christ." Spiritual warfare is in our hearts and minds, and it's fought with thoughts and ideas. That's the reason knowing the evidence for our faith is so important. That's the reason I think apologetics is so important. So we can help others take their thoughts captive to what Christ wants it to be. So we're going to apply this method. I've told you about this. I'm not going to go into detail tonight. Arrow, it's a way we can judge and test and compare different viewpoints and interpretations. And we're going to use this method that we used in the last class. I used to call it 5-minute apologetics. I got into a little bit of copyright issues, so I have to change the name. So it's beneath belief now. That's a long story. But we're going to be focusing on one portion of that. And that's really when we are having a conversation with a new person or someone in your family, and they're struggling with, is there really a God? That's where we have to focus. This continuum is how you determine how you have that conversation, because people can speak the same words and mean different things. So you always have to identify where they are. But for the purposes of this class, we assume that they believe their truth can be known, but they either don't believe there's a God or they're conflicted with whether there really is evidence. They might be agnostic or atheist in that case. And all this is part of, like I said, it's really part of our worldview. Everything I talk about is always worldview oriented, because I think the worldview is how you view the world. It's how you see reality. And how you view reality determines a lot about not only who you are, but how your life is going to go and ultimately what's going to happen after your life. So always keep that in mind when we hear these different arguments for and against God. We have to think of the worldview that's behind those ideas, because how we address them is based on how they're viewing the world, because we're trying to give them a lens so they can see what the world really is like more clearly. That's really what evidence does. So we have to be willing as Christians to look at, we want to know why and the why nots. We have to look at both sides of the argument. We have to be willing to honestly and intensely look at the arguments both for and against our positions. We should do this in every aspect of our life. as Christians, we're truth seekers because Jesus is the truth, right? And so we should let the truth lead us to what it is that God wants for us. Whatever the evidence supports, that's the truth, even if it's not what I think I believe. We've got to be willing to adjust when God gives us better information. And we'll always use this method. And well, I say this a lot, but I'll say it again. You use this method to make every decision. Cumulative case, you weigh the goods and the bad, and you decide which way you're going to drive to go to work or to the store using this method. In the scientific realm, we do the same thing. We weigh the evidence, and whatever the evidence leans toward, then that's most likely what's true. This is just a technique. I think God created it, since it's the way we think, and God created us. So we can honestly weigh the pros and cons in the argument of does God exist, and not be scared of the outcome. We're going to trust the evidence, okay? And this is 101 evidences for God that I've talked to you about before, and it's a short list. There's a lot more we could say. The ones in blue, we kind of talked about in the previous class. The ones in red, we're going to be delving into over the next 6-8 weeks, okay? And then there's a bunch of others. You could do this type of a class for forever. There's a lot of evidence is worth digging into, but we're going to refine it down to 6 main categories for this class. In 2 weeks, when we'll kick off the class on the 3rd, we'll do evil, or the problem of evil. This is what most atheists think is the strongest argument against God. And we're going to talk about, as a Christian, how we deal with these things. Now, this does not explain why bad things necessarily happen. That might be completely out of our realm. But when we talk about it philosophically, we understand who's in control. We'll be able to explain and address what is really a main concern of a lot of people. Then we'll do math, because I'm an engineer and a scientist, and I like math. If you don't like math, you're still going to like this, because math points to God, and we're going to make it pretty. Believe it or not, math is beautiful. And we're going to look at fractals and logic and reason. And the kids have seen this a little bit in our youth church already. There are so many things that are so beautiful in the conceptual world, and they're also the same image and shapes are found in the natural world. Well, how can a natural thing and a conceptual thing be so similar and so beautiful? Well, because they both come from the same mind. And that will be a lot of fun. Then we'll go to data. That doesn't sound very exciting, but communication, language is so critical to everything that we take for granted. Why can we do that? The naturalist perspective doesn't have a good explanation for that. We'll even talk a little bit about DNA code and how it is such an advanced information system that we have nothing in the world other than DNA itself that is nearly as complex as DNA. The more they do research, the more things they find out are in DNA. And there's information outside of DNA that comes from someplace and no one can quite figure out quite yet that helps us to decode our DNA. And we'll talk about those things. Then we're going to talk about astrophysics, or astronomy, things in space. And most of this is going to be challenging the idea of billions of years, which is very critical to the evolutionary model. It doesn't prove short Earth, okay? It doesn't prove those things, but what it does is their system does not work when you look at certain things. They just ignore it. When you take a astronomy class or a physics class and they get to these topics, they just turn the page because they know their models and their ideas don't explain things. They only want to look forward. They don't want to look backwards, because when they look backwards, their systems fail. And then we'll look at origins of life. We'll look at life itself and how complex it is. We'll look at nanomachines that are inside our cells that are so complex. And what's amazing is they're almost like things that we now have designed to work in our rotary motors, propelling systems. And we are working as engineers to try to invent these things, and God already invented it at the nanoscale. And I think the diversity and adaptation, and we'll look more at, obviously, the genome. We'll look at the arguments for evolution, and then we'll look at the arguments that challenge what evolution is telling us. As Christians, we need to know both. That way we can provide information when a loved one is challenged by this. And then the last one we're going to do is kind of an odd one. We're going to look at beauty and aesthetics and emotions and how these things are, in the naturalist worldview, they don't make any sense. So where do they come from? And how do they address these things? They have a little trouble with this. But we're going to look at their arguments, and then we're going to look at our worldview and how does our argument stack up against theirs? Really, which is the best explanatory answer? And then that's where the evidence leans. And this is actually an excellent evidence for the existence of God, because the naturalist doesn't want to talk about it. They'll say things like, "There's really nothing to see there. It's just the way it is." That's a common theme that we'll actually talk about today. So, okay, pros and cons. So, I'm pretty certain that what I'm going to talk about tonight has probably never been talked about in a church before. And there's probably a reason for that, but you know me, I have to do it that way. These are the best arguments from the atheist perspective against the existence of God, and there are a lot of them. Don't dismiss these. These are very complex. These are very philosophical and intellectually complex. And they cannot be refuted with one or two word quick answers. So I think we should try to answer them, don't you think? And just to describe what they are, problem of evil, we'll talk about it in our class. The blue ones we're actually going to be addressing as we go through this class. Anthropic is this concept that atheists use where the universe is really centered around the person because their opinion is the standard. They don't have a standard outside themselves. So they'll use what we call anthropic arguments that are person-oriented. This teleological is this idea that it's really against the idea of fine-tuning or design of the universe. Basically, they throw up their hands and say, there's really nothing to see there. Why do you think it's complex? It's complex because it has to be. It ends up being really close to the brute facts and the necessity arguments. They're just, I would say, different flavors of the same argument, where they basically are just going to say, well, it's the way it is because it has to be the way it is, because that's the only way it is. That's their argument. And you'll see that as we kind of go through. They put in a lot of words to say that very simple thing. But I think you'll see how it tends to always settle down to the fact is I don't have an answer and it can't be God. That is the atheist perspective. We'll talk about evolution and science as we go through the class. But today, I want to work on these others. And I had to work pretty hard to figure out what these actually were. Pedagogy. I'll define it later. It took me a little while. Teachers should know what this is, by the way. Cultural and geographical arguments against God. Parsimony, burden of proof, divine hiddenness, reasonable non-belief, and incoherence. And these are just titles. I'll explain what they are as we kind of go through. But again, these are difficult. If you're not prepared and someone tosses one of these at you, you could have one of those weak knee moments and not know how to respond. And what we want to do as Christians is be able to ask the right question, fill in the right blank to hopefully address the misconception or the wrong idea that somebody has in a way that will allow them to see that, well, they don't have a complete picture, and hopefully look for that complete picture. Or maybe even ask us, well, what makes you say that? And that's a great opportunity to actually explain to them why I say that, right? And we need to understand that in the world of atheism and agnosticism, they want to separate these three things: science, philosophy, and theology. Atheism is always leaning towards science, and they're saying you shouldn't use theology or philosophy to try to answer these questions. Everything can be answered via naturalism, via hard science, observable science. Problem with that, that's a philosophical view. And what you'll find is most of the atheist claims, which sound very scientific, are really philosophy. They're not science at all because there's no evidence for what they claim. And that's one of those things we want to talk through. So what I'm what I'm saying, and I think this is true, is I think all three of these are part of a whole. God works in all of these areas. I believe science points to God. I believe philosophy points to God. I believe theology is a study of the one true God, or it should be. And when you use these in combination, they work in harmony and they give you a fuller picture of what you're looking at. If you only focus in on science, you're going to miss things that we cannot observe, we cannot test. We can only really discuss those in philosophical and theological realms. So if you shut one of these out of your thought process or say you shouldn't use it, you really have an incomplete view of what's going on around you. Okay? So, all right. Pedagogy. Anybody know what it is? I knew you would know. I won't let you answer. It's a philosophy of teaching. So anybody have a guess on how the atheist uses this against Christians? Okay. What they'll say, let me make sure I'll read it so I don't screw it up. So the skeptic will say something like this. If a loving God wanted people to know Him, ultimate truth would not depend so heavily on who taught you, or where you were born, or when you were born, or what community you were in. It's kind of like it'd be a cultural, geographical argument. You'll see a lot of these overlap. Another version of it might look like this, where they say, human beings are so easy to misteach, manipulate, and indoctrinate. Since belief is so shaped by pedagogy, culture, and unequal access, see how they slip something in? Good teaching, that is, it seems like evidence that there couldn't be a perfectly loving God that has made Himself clear to everyone, because we rely so heavily on who teaches us and where we live. So it's actually a difficult question. Anybody want to try the challenge? These are tough. I mean, what do you say to someone that grew up in a country that doesn't have any Christian teachers, didn't have access to anything? What's the answer? Well, that's very true. Quiet back there. So this is really a form of what we would call the divine hiddenness argument. It's just being repackaged to sound very high and mighty a little bit. But if you think about it, it's like you're defining what a loving God looks like. That makes you above God? Because if you define what God is, that means you know better than God. That makes you the God. You see how the anthropic argument rolls into the atheist view? They become the standard. They're telling you what God should or should not be. So let's look at it. We'll look at it in pieces. There are several different ways to attack this one. You have to kind of work with who you're talking to. The first one that I would use, maybe, it's frozen. We need to differentiate between clarity and coercion. What they're talking about is the fact that pedagogy is really coercive, right? You're manipulating people, you're indoctrinating people. And the first thing we need to ask is, who or what is the standard for our comment on this? If you're coming from the same background that I am, then we can't really make a comment on this because we're both have the same background. So it's not relevant to us having a difference of opinion. If the standard is a person, that means there's no standard at all. We know that. A standard has to be outside of yourself in some way. So again, clarity or coercion, I think the atheist would say something like this. He'd say, why do you think a loving God would not make His existence so clear to everyone they could not deny it? And atheists say this. How do you answer them? Any ideas? Well, I think the clear thing is, what makes you say that? Who's getting to define who God is? It's not actually a critique about whether God exists. It's more a critique of whether they like the God that they've imagined in their own head, right? And a lot of these arguments tend to be that way. They're not really evidence against the existence of God. It's evidence against the one they imagined, which didn't exist in the first place. I think they're just looking for an excuse. But another way to attack this one might be something like mediated learning. What I mean by this is a Christian might talk in terms of the fact that we actually believe that revelation comes through people. We believe that we should be involved in our cultural transmission. We believe interpretation and continued guidance is a critical part of our Christian life. So, of course, God would want us to learn that way. If everything came to us suddenly, where's the purpose? Where's the meaning in life? We yearn for growth as humans. So I think the argument that you want everything instantly is an unreasonable argument, and I would actually challenge them to use that same argument against evolution. Why is evolution not clear to everybody, obviously? And where's the proof? They don't like that very much, because they'll sputter and they'll throw something out at you, and then they hope you don't have a PhD in science and can refute them and, whatever else. Okay. Another one, human brokenness, right? Actually, bad pedagogy is something we would predict as Christians. We call it the fallen world, right? It's not a critique on a good God. It's a critique on the bad people and the fact that we often teach things that aren't in line with what God would want. So this argument actually ends up twisting against the atheists and being an argument for the God of the Bible, because it's completely supported by the Bible that we read and we teach, because we believe in this fallenness. And I think as Christians, we believe the world is actually best when we grow together through instruction and correction and studying and learning and patience, sometimes failure, and most importantly, community. That's actually how our worldview works. So this argument against God, once you analyze it, actually is an evidence that the Christian worldview is actually consistent with bad pedagogy. It's bad teaching. But these are philosophical, so slow me down. So that was the easy one. Oh, they steadily get worse. This one's not too bad. Geographical and cultural. And it'll be really similar to what they said for the pedagogy. They'll say something like, a skeptic might say, the fact that religious beliefs is so heavily dependent on the place and time of your birth suggests that gods are products of human culture and indoctrination rather than universal truths. That's actually what they'll say. You guys have all those different gods in religion, because they'll lump us in with all the other religions and say, which God you worship is depending on where you grew up. It's depending on who your family was. And that is true to some extent. So what do we do with this one? You got it. If you've ever read the book Tactics by Greg Koukl, I would use one of his methods, and I would say, so what's your point? The Christian worldview agrees with that. We accept people from every demographic and culture. We don't discriminate against anybody. We believe that regardless of where you started, it's the final that really matters. And it's unlike most other worldviews. The Christian worldview is literally open to people from any way of life, age, gender, nationality, color of skin, you name it. Atheist worldview, it's survival of the fittest. They could not care less about this. So why are they arguing using it when their worldview doesn't care? Or if you look at other religions in the world, they're all inward looking. Most are only concerned about their group. They don't care what a group from another culture is doing. Christian missionaries will go and help Muslims. They'll go and help Hindus. They'll go and help whoever. We are outward looking because this does not matter in our worldview. So arguing against Christianity using a worldview that's actually consistent with Christianity, philosophically it sounds really good until you look at it and realize it's like, well, it's actually, again, it's the opposite. So that's the easy two. Parsimony, Occam's razor. Anybody heard of this before? It's a philosophical perspective. It basically says the simpler explanation is usually preferred over a more complex one. It's a guidance in making decisions, basically. If you add extra stuff on to an idea, you get rid of those. You try to pare it down to the bare minimum that still explains just as well. So that's Occam's razor. So it sounds really scientific, and the scientists will use it like it's scientific, but this is 100% philosophical. So here's the argument against God. We should not multiply entities beyond what is necessary, or the necessity. Natural explanations already account for what we see. Therefore, adding God is unnecessary. You hear this all the time if you listen to scientists talk. They don't need that extra thing. Naturalism, evolution, explains everything. What do we do with this? You're going to hear this in school if you go to public school. You go to college, you'll hear it in the philosophy classes and in science classes. We must be prepared to answer this, and this is not easy. Let me make it a little simpler. Instead of saying God did it, it is simpler to say the universe exists and operates by the impersonal laws we call, the laws of nature, right? Sounds really philosophical and scientific, and how do you address that? Every atheist you find on TV and YouTube is going to use this argument.
It's perfectly done.
It is? Good argument?
Perfectly done to such an extent that it's so aligned absolutely perfectly. If any one of those buttons off, none of it would work.
So true.
But does that prove there's a God?
Well, what I think the problem with this method or this argument is it kind of appeals to our nature a little bit, because we have a fallen nature, and our instincts are like, it sounds like it makes sense, right? Because it's a philosophical rule. We shouldn't invent things that we don't need. So if the lightning strikes and we can explain it with physics, we don't need to say God made it happen, because physics made it happen. That's how they would kind of give you an example. So what do we do? It does seem like in their view that God is unnecessary.
Who controls physics?
Very good.
What is the universe?
Yeah, very good.
I mean, that goes back to Aristotle, right? The whole, what brought everything into motion. Like, if there are these impersonal laws, right, how did the laws come into existence? Like, what was the cause that caused all of these events?
Yeah, the first cause, the unmoved mover.
Descartes, and that's somebody they bring up a lot too, right? They'll say, Descartes, I think, therefore I am. And it's like, well, you're not understanding what he was saying with that statement itself.
Because you're thinking in the first place,
Yeah,
right?
God has to exist, and it's because I can cut away everything else, but I cannot cut away the fact that I know I did not create myself.
So actually, along that same lines, first place to start is simpler is not always truer. Simpler is just simpler. Okay, this is a philosophical rule. It is not a yes or no answer. I mean, let me give you an extreme example. Our meal today could have just magically appeared because it's all natural, right? It's all made out of biological things we can find. Or it could have been planned, right? Now, which is simpler? But it just showed up by magic, right? It's this one thing. But it took a lot of phone calls and text messages, and people had to go to the store and bring me ice cream. That is actually the better explanation, but it's not really simpler in this type of philosophy. So I think that the Christian can take this and just say something like this. If God explains features in reality that naturalism cannot, then God is not unnecessary. It appears that he might be the better explanation. And in fact, naturalism cannot explain very many things. They think they can, but they always stop before they actually get to the explanation. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we go through. Another way to approach this is there's a difference between the ultimate and an extra. Now, the atheist is going to talk about the universe as the universe and energy and matter and all those natural laws, and then you Christians are adding God on top of all of that. But see, the Christian will say, no, God is the reason for all those things. He's not some add-on. He is the ultimate explanation for each and every one of those things, and actually the only explanation for those things. So again, they want the cluttered add-on. We say, well, without God, there is nothing to clutter in the first place. But this is the one that I see most often, is this idea that natural laws may describe things, but they don't fully explain things. And the atheist is going to challenge this a little bit. Well, let me hold that for a second. Let me expand on this just a little bit. The reason I would say this is I think as a Christian, we should argue that God explains things that naturalism can't. Things like why things exist in the first place, right? Why the universe is so ordered. Why can I actually think instead of just random thoughts? Pete?
Well, naturalism, too, it just describes average things, right? It describes things that we see, like, repeatedly. But it's not going to describe a one-off event, what they call, like, a black swan event in science.
Mm-hmm.
Like, just because you see an earthquake in California all the time doesn't mean that an earthquake can't happen in Texas, because you don't oftentimes see earthquakes happen in Texas, right? Like, these events can still happen. They're not going to be explained by these natural laws that we think that we see. That's because the natural laws only describe the average. That's something you learn in data analysis, right?
Right.
It's standard deviations. So yeah, the standard deviation, 70% might be explained, but what about that other 30% that is not going to be average? That's why we don't aspire towards average as Christians.
And that's really the fallacy of parsimony or Occam's razor, because simple does not always mean correct. It just means it's simpler. That's really what it means. And in some cases, it's a good guide. But let's look at it this way. God is simpler than many brute facts. A naturalist claim is actually not a claim. It's lots of claims. Okay, they have to have all those natural laws. They have to be perfectly tuned for life. They have to have billions of years, and they have to have all these things. They actually have a very complex sequence of events that have to happen perfectly, randomly, which is, those two words don't actually work together, perfectly and randomly. So God actually is a simpler argument, but they will use something like this. And again, I don't think of Occam's razor as a proof, but really it's a guide. But they're going to challenge us this way. I didn't find in my notes. I want to say this. They will say that, naturalism explains so many things that used to be attributed to the divine entity, right? And then they're going to throw out examples, and we better be prepared. The common one now would be origins of life. So let's say science has explained origins of life. Science can explain why the planets orbit the sun and all those things. Science and physics explains all of that. It actually doesn't. Well, origins of life is very contested. We'll talk about that another time. Did you know that you have no idea how the Earth orbits the sun? There's not an astrophysics guy in the universe that can explain it. Do you know what the three best arguments are right now? Well, actually, there's four. There's maybe four. The first one is there is an invisible ninth planet that adds gravity to the solar system that allows us to orbit the way we do. Because there's some force holding things together that we don't know about in science. So it's this invisible ninth planet. Or they'll use dark energy, or they'll use dark matter, all to try to account for this magical force that we know in science exists, but we can't see it. And then I heard a new one It's just as I think it was on Monday, some guy has come up with this idea that all that extra stuff is really leaking into our universe from a parallel universe. You know what all these ideas have in common? They're not science. They're science fiction. They're good imaginations, but the imagination is because God is not a possibility in their worldview, so they have to imagine something that can make up for what we already know as Christians. The thing that holds the universe together is God. I don't have to look for an invisible night planet. Okay, parsimony. The question really becomes, God is either unnecessary or the best explanation of reality. I think as Christians we know how we would answer that. Okay, now we get to the tough ones. Burden of proof. Let me just read this to you because this is actually one of the tougher ones. And I've seen a lot of debates with atheists and secular humanists, and they always use this kind of argument. They'll say the claim that God exists carries full burden of proof. There is no evidence for God, therefore belief is not warranted, and sincere people don't find God obvious. They always kind of add this one at the back end, because they're sincere about it. What do we do? How do you address that? So the first thing we got to recognize is, to the atheist, the default position is no God. I think that's the default. Everybody starts in that same position. As a Christian, we say, not so fast, right? We have to recognize that burden of proof just means this: responsibility to provide adequate reasons or evidence for your claim. If you make a claim, you have to provide a reasonable burden of proof. So if you say there is no God, does that sound like a claim? It does. I say God exists. Does it sound like a claim? It does. I believe in equal burden of proof. I don't think we should use this against each other. We're both making claims, because if you disagree with me, you're claiming I'm wrong, you better come with some evidence. And we should not be scared of the evidence. And people fight over this and debates and all this kind of stuff. It's like, how about let's just bring the evidence to the table? But that would be for reasonable people. So let's look at this argument and how we would attack it as a Christian. First of all, get rid of the full part. The claim God exists carries burden of proof just as much as the one that says God doesn't exist. All right? So the naturalist needs to recognize we're on equal footing when it comes down to needing evidence for our views. There is evidence for God, okay? And therefore we believe faith is warranted. And I'm at least one sincere person that sees God as obvious. So I think what we need to point out to them, and these arguments are opinion. Well, how about let's get to the evidence. You can't use the argument as evidence. You have to look at evidence. This is just, my opinion is you're wrong, therefore you must be wrong because I'm me and you're you and I'm right. And but we allow them to do this too often. All right. Okay, these next ones are kind of fun and they're also very complicated. Reasonable non-belief. It kind of tacks onto those blue letters at the bottom. Sincere people don't find. So a skeptic might say something like this: the existence of a reasonable non-belief, so that's how they would title this, the fact that many people do not believe in God despite searching for truth, argues against the existence of a loving God who wants to be known. Reasonable, sincere people find no evidence of God, therefore there is no God. It's tough, actually. You might even hear this version. This one's many phenomena once attributed to God, I talked about this a little earlier, are now completely explained by science. Now fully explained by natural processes like evolution and physics, reducing the necessity for the God of the gaps. And they'll sneak that in. Yeah, you're just trying to fill in the gaps so you don't understand something, you say it's God. So What do you do with it?
You have to ask, what is reasonable? Because again, even Aristotle, right? The
Yeah.
guy who's like the head of critical thinking.
Yeah.
That's where we get our idea of critical thinking from. He said all the proof points towards there being a God, right? There had to be something that brought everything in. So if you're going to claim to be reasonable, or that you're using critical thinking, or that you're using logic, why not rely on the very people who were claiming that they created logic, right? Or the idea of logic, our understanding of it.
Well, I've heard this from a lot of leading atheists in the early 2000s. They would use the phrase settled science. It's settled science. Okay, as a scientist, that makes me shudder because there's no such thing as settled science. Okay, there's settled stupidness, but there can't ever be settled science because the scientists always search for something, right? We can always find something that changes our perspective. So anytime they use that, I call that a bait and switch. It sounds scientific, but it's just a philosophical claim. It's just an opinion. Go ahead, Christian.
I think another good example too, right, is that the universe is finite, right? Because, and especially a lot of atheists believe in the Big Bang. But how can you say that, particles all of a sudden came out of nowhere and created this chemical reaction that created a giant bang that created the red shift and shows the expansion of the universe that could go back in time, right? But, nothing something can't come from nothing. And in order for that, how can you create a beginning from nothing?
Yeah, they have a lot of interesting arguments. We actually talked about one the last class we had. A guy from Dr. Krauss out of Arizona State, is a quantum physicist, and he claims that nothing can make something, but he redefines what nothing is. His nothing is matter, space, and time. And he says matter, space, and time can come from matter, space, and time. It's like, okay.
But there was a comedian who at one point he was a preacher, and that was kind of the joke that he had made about that as well. So you believe in nothing, and something came from nothing, and he goes, well, what did God come from? God, you could probably define him as nothing, all of a sudden created everything and stuff. And in a way, it's like, you inadvertently believe in God without me.
Well, you kind of proved God as a necessity by your own argument, right? Yeah. So reasonable non-belief is actually an impossibility because I won't use his name, but there was a guy who claims to be a secularist, a human secularist or secularist humanist, I don't know, whatever it was. He's here from Texas, a Christian that became an atheist. And he was put in a kind of on the spot and asked, it's like, well, what evidence, since you found this evidence that turned you away from God, what evidence would it take that would change your mind back to believing in God? And he answered honestly, nothing. Even if God came and stood in front of me, I still would not believe. I would think I was just hallucinating. That's not reasonable. But often the arguments are unreasonable, so I don't think reasonable non-belief is really a possibility. We're even biased. We have to recognize that we are. You have to identify your own bias so you can evaluate somebody else's, and then honestly look at the evidence as unbiased as possible. Then you can be reasonable. What that does to belief, you're going to believe whatever you believe because you think you're right. So it's one of these weird little arguments. But this one gets a lot of traction about 10 years ago. Okay, divine hiddenness. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I don't understand why Christians struggle with this one. The critic will argue like this. It will say, if God exists and desires a relationship with humanity, you see this theme in all their arguments going after the loving God that they've created in their minds. If God existed and desired a relationship with humanity, He would, so they're telling us what God does now, right? He would provide clear, unambiguous evidence of His existence. The complete lack of objective scientific evidence for the supernatural is seen as evidence of absence. That's often how this is referred to.
But God has. We have the Bible.
Well,
We have Jesus.
you know what I like about this argument is, especially the way this one was framed, scientific evidence for the supernatural. Science can only see the natural. you really can't have scientific evidence for the supernatural. Then it wouldn't be supernatural, it would just be natural. It's kind of, they've kind of put an argument together that actually is a logical fallacy in itself. But they're saying he would, so they're dictating to God how he's going to behave in the universe that he made. Again, it's a straw man argument. And I think there's several ways to kind of attack this as a Christian. My favorite is love. Not just because I love people, but because love requires a choice. I can't force someone to love me. Without choice, there's no love. So if God made his existence so obvious that everybody had to acknowledge it whether they liked it or not, there's no place for love. It takes away free will. That's a good job.
Emotion. I mean,
It is.
scientific proof.
That's the reason we're going to...
What's the scientific proof why people cry?
Well,
What's the scientific proof for grieving? What's the
Well,
scientific proof for
they have some arguments. We're going to talk about that in the last week of the class on emotions. We need to look at their view, but I agree with you. But I think love is a good way to counter this argument of hiddenness. Anybody have any others? Christian.
I think our evidence, like she was saying in the Bible, there are multiple books where God does show himself, or shows his acts to people in the Old Testament stuff. A good example would be Exodus. Whenever they're traveling through the wilderness,
Yeah.
they cry out and challenge God multiple times, and they create manna from stone, or they hit the stones and create manna from it, and everything else. And if God does make himself known and where he can be seen, man will just take it for granted.
Well, and you see that in Exodus story where they get so used to God being around, they get complacent toward the cloud and the pillar of fire, right?
And the Tower of Babylon could be another one too.
Exactly. Well, I actually would go further and say that the Bible actually addresses the hiddenness as a necessity. Jesus talks about this, that he teaches in parables because he doesn't want to overwhelm people's free will. If I did that, they would turn to me and be healed, is what he says. And what he means is it takes away the free will. They don't want to turn to me. I would force them if I wasn't hidden. And I think without divine hiddenness, we'd lose things like intellectual pursuit. If we got everything dumped on us all at once, we wouldn't search for things. We wouldn't learn. Where would be the satisfaction and purpose and meaning of our life if we didn't have that accomplishment that comes from learning and doing things? If you learned everything you needed to know about God the instant you were born, it would take away a lot of those things. So I actually think, based on God's characteristics that are described in the Bible, divine hiddenness is a necessity. It's not evidence of absence. It's evidence of love. It's evidence that God has people that he's designed to make decisions, and he doesn't want to force them. He wants them to love him and make those choices for themselves. So I actually don't think divine hiddenness is a good argument. I really don't. It's the reason I'm not going to spend much time on it. So I wanted more time than this, but this is the toughest one, is incoherence. And the general argument goes like this. It's sometimes that's what it's called. Incoherence of divine attributes is kind of the full title. And it will be this idea that God is logically impossible because its defined attributes are internally contradictory or meaningless. This is what they call theological non-cognitism or ignitism. I had to look them up. It just means God's existence is meaningless. It's like, I can't believe they have isms for something like that. But if you think about this, it seems like, what is he talking about? Well, when I start showing you the arguments, it's going to be more challenging than you think. I'll show you the first one. The first one's a common one. You've probably seen this one. It's omnipotence versus logic. This is the old paradox argument. Can God make a stone that he can't lift? If he's really all-powerful, he should be able to do anything he wants. Why can't he make a stone he can't lift? You guys know this one?
That's logically inconsistent though, right?
Right.
If he is omnipotent, then obviously he wouldn't be able to make something that would make him not omnipotent.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
It is kind of crazy. And it's a misrepresentation of what omnipotence really is, right? Because it's all-powerful does not mean you can do illogical things. You can't make a square circle. You can't make a married single person. You can't make a wet dry thing. Those are logical fallacies. God can't do that because He defined it. He could choose to define it different and then it would work that way, but God defined how the universe works, and those things are not possible. They're logical fallacies. So God can't break His own character because it's His character. He defines those things and then He behaves according to His own definitions because He's God. And so this one I think is pretty weak, but it gets harder. Omniscience and freedom. If God has perfect foreknowledge of all future events, it is argued that free will cannot exist. And every action is already locked in and unchangeable by God's own knowledge. It's okay. So all those bad things, God has predicted it. Now, sadly, we have Christian theology that agrees with this. I won't call it out tonight. How do we handle this? Because the atheists are using our own theology against us. Christians can be our own worst enemies. God is all-knowing, so He has to know everything. That means He has to have made everything. Okay? That means He made everything happen. And it keeps going and going. How do you deal with this?
Just because there's knowledge of something doesn't mean that there's not choice. You know what I'm saying?
Well, I'll put it different. I'll say, God knowing doesn't mean He has to alter the outcome. Right? He could choose not to alter outcome.
Is it free will?
Yeah, free will. If He made us to have free will, He can know we're going to make a bad decision and love us enough to allow us to make that bad decision.
We are.
Parents let their children make mistakes all the time.
Exactly. I don't know why we think it's so complicated.
It's hot.
So I believe God can allow free will without diminishing His all power at all. I actually think people that think God has to be meticulously in control of everything diminish who God really is. But that's an argument for another time. Omniscience and moral perfection. These are going to get steadily more complex. So, okay, the critic argues this way. If God knows everything, I think we'd agree He does, right? He must know what it feels like to lust and envy. Since experiencing those feelings is considered a sin, how can God be both all-knowing and morally perfect? You got to think about it. This is not easy.
Jesus was in all ways tempted as we are.
But did He know lust and envy?
He knows what's right.
He knows what it's like and He knows how to turn it down.
But lust and envy, these sins are actually the absence of God. So it's like,
Yeah.
He knows of His own absence in somebody, of the absence of His own relationship. But it doesn't mean that He's experiencing it in the same way that we experience it.
Yep, you're exactly right. I think the place to start is the fact that all these negative things we call sins are absences of God's goodness. And we'll talk about when we talk about the problem of evil. They're opposite of God's standard. But let me ask you this. Do you know of anything you have not experienced? Give me an example, Judy.
You're gonna fall if you jump off the building. I don't need to experience it to know that I'm gonna
Well, you
die.
probably jumped off of something. That one's cheating.
With men, right, we know of childbirth, but we're never going to experience it. We do know that there's
But you've got a chance to see it, maybe.
But we're not going to know the pain of it. We're
That's
not gonna
true.
know what it's like to carry a baby.
It's true.
But we do know that there's things that come along with it, right? That while we may not be able to experience it, we can see how they affect the other person. So like with a woman, we can see how it's going to affect her emotions, how it's going to affect, her body, right? And we can also see the result of the pain and then the pleasure, I guess, that comes from after the child's born, getting to raise it up, right? So it's like we can see the effect of childbirth, but we're not ever going to personally experience it ourselves. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, so I would make a simpler one for me. It's like, I know if I dive into the ocean and swim down 50 meters, I'm going to die. I have never experienced that. Don't plan to, but I can learn from other people's experience.
Quick breathing for 6
Yeah, just put a sack over your head. I mean, there's all different things. You don't have to literally experience to know the outcome. So God knowing what envy and lust is just knowledge. He doesn't have to have it experientially. And in fact, the best way to learn things, kids, is from somebody else's experiences, so you don't have to do it yourself. Learn from me. I made plenty of mistakes. Don't do it. Don't do it. So, yeah, I think this is a very crafty way that they've kind of phrased it, but it's an untruth. It is essentially a logical fallacy. You actually don't have to know something to know of something. That's crazy. All right. Justice and mercy. Logical fallacy. A perfectly just being must ensure everyone gets exactly what they deserve, while a perfectly merciful being allows everyone to avoid what they deserve. These two traits are seen as contrary to each other. Therefore, in their superlative form, they can't exist in the same being. How do you deal with this one?
I think having an understanding that something that is way beyond us, that has created everything, it's going to have a different understanding than we do. And if you want to give like an analogy of a parent and a child, right? A child may see something as good and bad, but a parent has an understanding of what is actually good and what is actually bad. So the way that they may rear their child, they have that understanding, like we were talking about in the last example, that they're stopping them from doing something to prevent them from getting hurt.
Yeah,
And
it's
so
good.
in that, the parent understands that that is good, but because the child is being denied experiencing it, they see it as bad. So it goes, our understanding isn't the same understanding as, what God's is. I mean, a hurricane can touch down, and take out a city, but, God might have an understanding that the way that that affects people or brings a community together could be seen as good. Well, everybody, especially in that time, can see it as horrible and tragic.
Come back in 2 weeks. We'll talk about the problem of evil. We'll have that argument, okay?
Justice, knowing, or ignorance, that's what it's.
Well, justice is, if in its purest form, is consequences for actions, right? Mercy is the very opposite, right? It's avoidance of consequences that justice would require, right? Well, for starters, they're trying to define who God is again. Okay, mercy and justice are two characteristics of God. We see it in the Bible. They're not mutually exclusive. In fact, that's the reason Jesus came and died on the cross. So in the Christian worldview, we completely agree with this argument, actually. God is perfectly just, and He had to make a way to be perfectly merciful, and that it required...
Justice is mercy.
Jesus came so He can be merciful without neglecting the justice part.
Amen. And so the Christian worldview, again, we step forward into it. It's like, you got it right. Let me explain the gaps in your idea, because that's exactly the Christian worldview. It's not versus, it's plus, right? And we embrace it because God is both these, and Jesus made a way so that we don't have to face the justice and we can embrace the mercy. But they both perfectly exist inside God. It's a... All right, one more. I'll let you guys go. Timeless versus action. Okay, so God is often described as timeless, unchanging, immutable, right? We say that all the time. Yet He's also a creator that performs actions like answering prayers, creating the universe, which are inherently temporal. Philosophers argue it's action, it's causation, all temporal concepts. They cannot be done by a being that's outside of time. It has to be inside time. What do you do with this one?
Well, it goes back to that second one that you brought up, omniscience versus freedom, right? It's like just because He has knowledge of all these things doesn't mean that it wasn't already planned out how it was all going to fall into place. See what I'm saying? So they're saying that, oh, well, it's action, but it's like if the actions were already dictated by that timeless being, right? It's like it's all falling into place the way that it's supposed to. That there's no change in what he's doing because it's already happening the way that it was going to happen anyways. We just perceive it as that there are possible differences. It's like this whole idea of the multiverse, right? Like, multiverse doesn't make any sense. There's no, separate parallel universes that branch off of our decisions. That doesn't make sense. First of all, universe means one and all. It means everything in and of itself. Like the very word itself means the totality of things as they are. So to try to say that there's multiverses where these other parallel universes would have to exist as part of the universe anyways, just by the very nature of the etymology of the word itself.
Yep.
So what you're describing doesn't make any sense. You see what I'm saying? Like,
Well, they're defining God their own way. So if someone comes up to me and says that someone cannot be timeless and make actions inside time, you know how I respond? Why not? What's your basis for saying they can't? I mean, you made up something, but why not?
There are conversations too of things being in between space and time. Like there are the possibilities of what's possible in science but not possible.
Yeah, no, I mean it's like this is like a non-argument to me. You can't comprehend it. I'm sorry, I can. It's no big deal, you know. And I think you have to be a little snarky because they're being snarky to us, and you can't worry about offending people sometimes because they're offending you when they give you this argument a little bit. You need to just be kind. But if their feelings get hurt because you say, I don't understand what your problem is. This perfectly aligns with the God that I know. Do you want me to help you get to know the God that I know? So, what do you guys think? So that was our arguments against God. Did you like it? Is this the type of stuff you want to see? Because I think as Christians, we should not shy away from what the atheist says or the agnostic says or whoever says. Invite it in. What makes you say that? It's a great question. It's actually one of my favorite questions. What makes you say that? And then as they explain, it's like, well, how did you come to that conclusion? And you ask that question about 3 or 4 times, they'll either turn and run away or they're going to ask you the obvious question, which is you're in. What do you think?
I think this is kind of an essential part of being a Christian too, right? It's like if you read Proverbs, the very beginning of Proverbs tells us that we should run after wisdom. Like if God is true, and like in the case of Israel, right, Jacob, it's like he wrestled with God. That's how he proved himself to be worthy of, creating the 12 tribes that Jesus would eventually come with. As Christians, we should strive to do the same thing. And even if you're not a Christian, if you want to call yourself a learned man, a scientist, somebody who's reasonable, it's like the whole point in being able to do that is to have these discussions, to actually go and run after truth. And, that's what Ecclesiastes tells us as well. It's like you can do everything else in life, but all of it is striving after the wind. The only thing that's actually reasonable in life or that will do anything for you is to try to know the nature of God. And to know the nature of God, we have to strive to find that evidence for God.
Yeah, it's a pursuit of truth is another way to put it, right?
Yeah, the Logos, right?
The Logos.
Because that's why they call Christ the Logos at the beginning of John. It's like Logos means reason. Like we are striving to find reason. We are striving to walk with Christ, to walk with the one who went and brought everything into existence and who defines existence as it is. Right? And to be able to do that, we have to understand how this existence works.
Oh, that's great.